Here we are back with the 30 days to Photoshop mastery in day 18. We're going to be talking about cleanup tools. We're going to stop talking about selections and masking for a little bit, and we're going to talk about tools that we can use to repair, patch, replace, or just in general, fix certain parts of our photograph that we don't want to look the way they do. This is a really powerful thing in Photoshop. We've already kind of talked about this with the healing brush in Adobe Camera Raw and Lightroom, but in Photoshop we have layers, which layers give us the ability to do just about whatever we want with these cleanup tools and fix our photos. So what you're seeing in front of you is a photograph that I took in Zion National Park, just outside the park, and what you'll notice is that right here on my sensor I have some type of piece of dust or something. Now this happened to me once when my wife and I were on vacation. I had a little big, it wasn't little, it was big. It was just like this, but slightly larger speck on all my images. And I thought my camera was broken. I thought maybe light leaked into my camera and destroyed my sensor. I was freaking out. I thought it was the end of the world. Upon further inspection, after I took my lens off, I found that there was a giant piece of lint on my camera sensor. And this is what a giant piece of lint looks like on your camera sensor. An otherwise great photo, or a photo that you feel really attached to, can almost feel like the worst photo you've ever taken when you get a slight speck like that on the photo. So we're going to talk about how to fix that today with all the different cleanup tools that are in Photoshop. We're going to break them all down and go over that. So I've already told you to do this before, but inside here you might have the patch tool selected or one of these other tools, but this is where I generally keep all of the healing and patching tools that Photoshop has. And what healing means, or cloning means, is basically you're just taking a spot from somewhere else in your photograph and using that spot to fix a spot in your photo that is the problem. So in this case, this is the problem. We're going to select the spot healing brush. Now, typically, I like to work on my own layer when I'm using these, and some of the tools up here might have something here that says sample. Based on the way it samples, you want to select current and below. This tool does not have a current and below for the spot healing brush tool. So that can be a problem. There is a sample all layer selection here, and we can select that, and then we can work on our own layer. But if there's anything above that layer, it's going to select everything above that layer as well, and that's where it's going to make the patch, and it doesn't work out quite as well. However, this one works out really well if you're working on just a background layer. For instance, we don't really need to be too concerned with all the patching that we're going to do in this photo because there's only one spot that's really the problem. So with that being the case, I probably don't need to go to the extent of making a whole new layer to do my cloning on. So with that, here's my background layer. I'm going to zoom in back here. Okay. Now this healing brush has several different ways that you can sample the area around this spot. Basically, what this is going to do when I have the spot healing brush selected, I right click and you can see it takes on whatever brush I have right here. So right now I have a hardness of 0%, which means it's a very soft edge brush and the size is 70 pixels. If you bring this hardness up to 100% and then you click on here and you do this, you might get a big patch with lines on the edge. So I usually recommend patching with something that's between 0 and 25%. This one didn't do it on it, so that worked out really well for us, but sometimes that can be a problem. So let's go back to the beginning here in our history. If the history palette here, we can always step backwards in the history palette here. So if you click the history, click back to where we started, and that's where we are, okay? So here we have the brush is at 70 pixels. It's a very soft edge brush. Keep the mode at normal almost 100% of the time when you're doing cloning, okay? Your type is going to be content aware, meaning it's going to, when you click and you move this over this spot, before you release, Photoshop's going to say, okay, are there any other pixels that are close to this area that look similar to this, and how can I patch this together? And then when you release that click, it fixes it and it patches it. And if we zoom out, it actually looks pretty darn good. Almost perfect, like it wasn't even there, right? So just a quick selection with the healing brush fixed that. Let's go over these other two. Create texture. So if we click on this and go over top of this, we don't want the create texture mode, because if you look at that, it's basically just making a texture from that area, applying it to the image, and it doesn't look good. It looks pixelated, it looks gross, and if we zoom out, you'll be able to see that that spot now just looks like a very blurry, even worse spot, okay? So if we go to proximity match, and then we click on this, it's going to select pixels that are close in proximity to this instead of patching it together with Photoshop, with what Photoshop thinks it should patch it with. That's what Content Aware does. Content Aware assesses what's around it and then fills it in with content. Proximity Match is going to look at the pixels that are next to it on either side and fill it in that way as well. Let's bring the diffusion down to 1. And then I'll click and I'll move over top of this and we'll see what that looks like. That doesn't look very good. You see that? We have the diffusion set to 1. It's taking a very literal selection of all the pixels around it, and the result is not very good. So the idea here is to make sure you have your diffusion high enough so that you get a good blend so that the viewer can't see it. So that's essentially the spot healing tool. Let's go back here and I'm going to open up the next tool down, which is the healing brush. The healing brush is another brush that's very similar to the spot healing brush. The difference here is you get something called current and below, current layer, or all layers. So I'm going to make sure that this is set to current and below. I'm going to take off the use legacy, because when I take that off, it now gives me the ability to use diffusion, which a diffusion that's high is pretty good, so we'll keep that at 7. I'm going to make sure that this is set to sampled and not pattern. I don't want to fill that in with the pattern. Again, our blend mode is normal. The difference here is that I can put this on its own layer. And this brush is different in that it needs to select a source. So to select a source, you're going to press Alt or Option. And that will say, okay, I'm going to select this area right here because I like this line. And I'm going to put this line underneath that cloud. So I'll select this, then I'll go over here. And then as I paint and move around, it's going to grab the pixels that are above that look very similar. And then when I unclick, because that diffusion is set to 7, we have a nice blend. So I'll press Alt or Option here and click on this area. And then I'll paint on here like this, and then I'll move up, and that should be a pretty good diffusion there as well. Okay, so the difference here is that after we've done that, it's not working on the background layer. You see this is on its own layer because we set this to current and below. What that means is it's going to assess all the layers that are underneath this layer to take its sampling from. Not just this background layer, but all the layers that are underneath, okay? At the time of making that adjustment, it will create that sampling from all the layers that are below it. And what that means is, let's say we take a curves adjustment layer here, okay, and we make this darker. I'm just doing this just for the sake of showing you this. And then we click on this layer. We'll just delete this for now. We'll make a new layer here. And if we zoom in here, we have current and below selected. I'm going to press Alt or Option. Maybe change this diffusion down to about 5 so it doesn't blend quite as much. I'll Alt or Option click right here, and then paint this in up here like this. Looks good. Okay. Click right here. Paint this in right here like this. Looks good, okay. Alt or Option click and do that again. Now, because this is set to current and below, it's basically making a very literal selection for all of the stuff that's below it. So if this layer gets turned off, that spot is not going to look that great. However, if we also move this down to here and then have that curve above it, it was taking a very literal selection from all the pixels and how they looked with this curves adjustment layer on it. So when you're using this healing method or many of these healing methods, once you actually make that adjustment, make sure you keep it where it should be in the layers stack. Okay, so once I have that curves adjustment layer here, it looks good because this is a clone layer from all the stuff that's below it. I'm going to delete both of these. That's really just to show you that this current and below selects all the literal pixels that are below this layer to make its patch width. Okay, I'm going to delete this. I'm going to delete this. Let's go to the next one because the rest of those you don't really need to know. This is called the patch tool. And the patch tool is very similar to the spot healing brush tool in that it does not have a way that you can sample the layers based on content aware so that you can make it on its own layer. So if you're going to use the patch tool, you have to use the patch tool on a background layer or on physical pixels. It needs physical pixels to do that. It can't be working on its own layer like the healing brush tool could. So we're going to zoom in here. So I'm press Control and Spacebar to zoom in. With the patch tool, it makes a selection. So you draw around the area that you want to patch. Okay, I'm drawing around that. And then I need to click this. You can see there's a little patch with an arrow next to it. It's basically saying, hey, I need you to move this over so I can sample something. So I'm going to keep the structure at about 4 or 5. That's very similar to what you would see with diffusion. I'm going to bring the color up a little bit so that I get a better blend and then move this over. And you can see that I get a visual representation of what it is that I'm going to be grabbing when I drop this or when I unclick. So when I unclick, it's going to make an assessment of all the pixels that are there. And it's going to do a pretty darn good job of that, making a selection around it. And then I grab the pixels from over there, and you can barely see it. The one thing you can see here is this area right here, which is a little bit lighter. So I might grab that, pull that down here, and patch it up that way. You might need to use 2 patches in order to fix that area. Okay, but let's take a look at this. Let's grab our magnifying glass, right-click, and fit on screen. Looks perfect. Look at that. Great way to patch something up by using the patch tool. So let's go to our history palette. Let's go all the way back to the beginning. I'm going to zoom in here The next one down is the content aware move tool. I'm not going to show you that now. I'll show you that in the next lesson because it's very similar to the other content aware things that we would do in our images. So I'm not going to do that right now. I'll show you that later. Okay. So with this patch here, I also want to use something called the clone stamp tool. Now the clone stamp tool, I'm an old school guy. This was the only tool that we had to do this back in the day. These healing tools that you have here are actually relatively new. The clone stamp tool is one of the oldest tools for repairing and fixing images. And because I've been using it for so long, it's just a tool that I go to by nature in order to fix my photos. So I'm going to show you the clone stamp tool. It's one of my favorite tools for this. Notice how up here we have our sampling that's set to current and below. Again, I can now use my own layer now because that says current and below so that I can make my cloning happen on this layer without affecting the background. So if I press Alt or Option, this is another thing that needs a sample. If you just try to click here, it's going to say, whoa, whoa, whoa. Could not use the clone stamp tool because the layer to clone has been moved or deleted. Alt click to define a source point on the active layer. Meaning, if you want to make a clone happen here, you have to give Photoshop some reference. We have this set to current and below, so it's going to read all of the layers, including the layer that I have here. If I press Alt or Option and click here, and then drag this over here to move it over here to patch this, you'll see that I get very similar to what happened over there with the patch tool. If I click and move up, it's going to patch that up with the clone stamp tool, and I can patch that up and that fixes that as well. And the clone stamp tool, a wonderful tool for this because it uses your actual brushes. You can use any brush you want with the clone stamp tool, not just the predefined brush that you would have for that tool like you saw with the healing brushes. So here I could use any brush in my inventory. Any brush that I have I can use for that. If I go to here, like the spot healing brush and right click, it doesn't give me the ability to use my brushes. It just gives me the ability to change the size and the hardness of this brush. All right, so that's the clone stamp tool. It's a very powerful tool. It makes a patch the size of your brush. So again, this is one of those things that you might want to have hardness set to about maybe 5 or 6%, maybe not fully down to 0% because then you get this really soft patch. But that looks really good, really simple. That's a very simple thing to patch and fix. You can see that we lost some of the cloud there. So if I wanted to repair that and fix up that cloud, I might need to grab some from somewhere else in this image in order to make that happen. So if I wanted to fix that top of that cloud that got removed, I might make a whole new layer here, use Alt or Option to select maybe from this cloud up here, and then patch that up. But what you can see is that we now have a much brighter spot right there than we have in the rest of that area. So you have to be pretty careful with how you're using this because if you grab something that's literally going to take from one area, it's not going to use that healing trick where it blends the pixels. It's literally grabbing from one area to the next. So much so that if I back out and I press Alt or Option and I click on this tree right here and I go up into my sky, I can actually draw the grass, Alt or Option, click right here, into the sky. Okay, so you really have to be very mindful of where it is that you're selecting from in order to patch and clone on your photograph. So I'm going to zoom in here. I'm going to show you a little trick. So if I go into, let's say, I'm going to combine some tricks in order to get that cloud to stay the way it is and match this area right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a curves adjustment layer and I'll press Alt or Option on that curves adjustment layer and clip that into just this patch right here. Okay. So now what I need to do in order to make that blend is just move the curve. Do I need to make it brighter? No, I need to make it darker. Where do I need to make it darker? I need to make it darker in the highlight areas. And do I want that to affect the color? No, I just want it to affect the luminosity. And that might be a little too much. So we just go until we can fake the viewer, okay? Just go until you can fake the viewer into thinking that that patch actually should be there, okay? And that might look good. Let's back out a little bit, okay? Turn that curve off, the before and after on that curve. See, it darkened down that cloud and also made that spot a little bit darker, which kind of matches some of the area around here. That could possibly happen where a little bit of that light actually creeps out through those clouds, so we could make that work. This might be a little too bright. The clouds don't match. Here they match, okay? So let's go ahead and look at this. This is a good practical application. Actually, in the course that I created for this clone stamp tool, I made this image look like no cars were there and no people were there using all of these cloning tools and patching tools, okay? So I'm going to give you a little demonstration on how you can do that. So let's first start with the patch tool here. I'm going to zoom in down here onto this car, okay? And this might happen where there's things in your frame that you just don't want them to be there. Well, you can patch them out. So if we grab this car, we just go around it and give yourself enough buffer around it around the object that you can select the whole thing. So we'll do that. We got enough buffer around it. Now we need to match this area up with something else in the image. Well, these lines seem to work out pretty well, don't they? So we clicked and we moved, and then when I release that click, it'll repair it. Look at that. Did a pretty darn good job of just making that disappear. We can do that around these people as well. Let's grab these people with the patch tool. Give yourself a pretty decent buffer around them, including their shadows, and then move that down until you get a part on the walkway that would look right for that area, and that looks good. Okay, that's the patch tool. The patch tool is very powerful. It's a tool that I'm just kind of starting to get used to because I never really used it before. I always used the clone stamp tool. So we can get rid of this car the same way. Just give yourself a little buffer around it. Let's go halfway through the car this time, and then we'll move down and select this area. Make sure those lines match up in the area that you're selecting. Okay, looks good. And then we can go and do the rest of the other half of the car. Sometimes just doing half at a time is good because then after I go around this half, I can go up here where I have a bigger selection and hit that, and it patches in pretty well. Sometimes you might get a hazy edge around the sides of it where this doesn't line up here. It's okay, just patch around there, grab that and move it up, patch that in, and that should fix it pretty well. Okay, so now they don't look like they're there. Let's move on to another tool. Let's say the spot healing tool. So I'm going to zoom in here on these people. With the spot healing tool, we don't need to hit Alt or Option. All we need to do is just start painting on our photo. So if I paint her away and just move like this, it might do a good job of patching that up. But you see, it's grabbing. It's like it's randomly grabbing from different areas. So that's one of the reasons why I don't like this brush as much. Let's go to the history and move back here. Okay, so I'm going to go back. I'm going to use the other brush here. A lot of times I don't use the spot healing brush. I actually use the regular healing brush because I can make a very literal selection from something like up here and then paint in on where I want her to disappear. Okay, and that looks pretty good. It's going to assess the pixels around and fix that up. Looks pretty good, doesn't it? Man, oh man, we can just make everyone just disappear on here. I love that umbrella there. I might keep that person there because that's kind of cool. I like that. That umbrella is really neat. This is where things get tricky. When you have a line that comes down somewhere in your image like this, and you need to patch up these people here. How do you fix that? Well, for this, I would tend to use the clone stamp tool because I think it's a really good tool for that. Again, we could be working on our own layer now because we're using the clone stamp tool. I'll make this brush much smaller by pressing the left bracket key. Much smaller. Basically just small enough that I can make a good sampling of something and still paint around. So I'm going to Alt or Option click right here on this area. And I'll bring this up so I can match that slanted line on this area here. And as I paint and move up, it's going to be sampling as I paint and move up. The problem with this is if I just keep painting all the way through, guess what? I'm going to start painting her over top of him or him over top of her, whatever that might be. So this is where you have to be like Costco on a Saturday. Sample often, okay? When you go to those big box stores that have, lots of food and they have samples, yeah, we take our kids there for lunch sometimes. I'm just kidding. We Alt or Option click here, and as I paint on this and move this up like that with the brush, I'll stop every once in a while. I'll press Alt or Option to reassess where I came from, and that locks it so that I don't paint her back where she was, or him, or whatever that might be. Alt or Option again and sample again. Click and move up and repair. Okay, so then now I've got a big area that I can work with to paint in this guy. So I'll Alt or Option click here and then paint this away. Okay, see how we can get rid of things in our photo that we don't want to be there very successfully and very easily. Now this whole photo can be done like this. As you may have seen, I replaced everything in this photo using these cloning and healing tools. They're extremely powerful. One thing you want to be careful of though is what's called a repeating pattern. Always stay away from a repeating pattern because the viewer will see a repeating pattern. For instance, if you look at the road, this is the only spot in the road, maybe other than this one, where we actually have this kind of pinkish light right here that's on the road, okay? So what I would want to avoid is if I'm cloning something and I grab from here and I paint right here just like that, and then I paint over here, again, sampling over here and paint like that. That's a repeated pattern. The viewer will see a repeated pattern, even the smallest one. They will point out a repeated pattern and be like, yep, you definitely use the clone stamp tool there. Over here, we don't see any repeated patterns anywhere. But one thing I would need to watch out for is this little white dot right here. That becomes a thing that could become a repeated pattern, which would give away the fact that I use the clone stamp tool. Not saying that you don't want to tell people and be untruthful about your editing process. But now the way this works is that this light right here is casting that reflection right there. This light is casting that reflection. It looks normal when there's only one. When there's three, it's like, wait a second, why isn't there a light right here? And why isn't there a light right here? So always avoid repeated patterns at all costs, okay? You want to make sure that you don't have repeated patterns in here because people would see it. Another thing for a repeated pattern is right here in this area here. Let's say I use a clone stamp tool and I'm selecting from these different areas here to paint in and get rid of these people. You'll see that I'm kind of breaking things here and they're not quite working out very well. I should have cloned and sampled another time. But if I were to select from maybe this area and then paint them in as I paint across here to match that pattern there, which looks pretty good. But watch what happens there. There's no light anywhere else around here that would create that reflection, because this reflection that we see right here is coming from this light, not a light that's 3 feet or 4 feet away from it. Okay, so always avoid repeated patterns because the viewer will spot them right away. And it's not that you want to be untruthful. It just doesn't look professional when you have a repeated pattern that is going to be in there. So what I want you to do for your homework, I want you to block out as many people as you can from this photo. Okay. Use all the different healing tools, all the different brushes that we have here, the healing brush, the patch tool, the clone stamp tool, to see how many cars and how many people you can get rid of in this photo. Take your time to go through this, because if you can learn these cloning and patching tools, you will be very, very far ahead of where I was when I first started using Photoshop. Because there are times when you've got a landscape photo and there's a twig in the way. Well, you don't want to go up there and break that branch off of the tree, because then you're not preserving the location. So if that branch is in the way, just in Photoshop, just clone it out. There's no problem with that. I mean, at some point that branch wasn't there, right? Because it had to grow into the frame. So it's not really being untruthful. You're just turning back time a little bit. It's a matter of perspective and how you look at it. But nobody will fault you for using the clone and patch tools, and it's not something that will destroy your integrity. Okay, this is something that we use to make our photos better. And as you can see with this photo, these people, there is a time in the day when nobody is on the street. Maybe. It's in Chicago, so probably not. That's the concept. That's the idea. Maybe you couldn't get there at that time, but you could get there at another time and make it look that way. In tomorrow's lesson, we're going to do a follow-up with some other tools that you can use for cleaning up and patching, healing, and repairing your photos as well.